Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Wayne. This is Voices for the Future, and today I'm here to talk about the subject of climate change with Danny Faber, who is really, I call you a climate change activist. You wear many hats in the field of climate change, and activist is the right word. So I'll read your bio, then we'll begin. So the name of this program is Neoliberalism and the Global Ecological Crisis Toward a New Future. And Danny, as a climate change activist, in our talk, we'll talk a lot about root causes and potential solutions. Danny is professor of sociology at Northeastern University and senior research fellow at the Global Center for Climate Justice. He's co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of the journal Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. He's also director of the Northeast Environmental Justice Research Collaborative. In addition, he's the author of numerous books and articles on the ecological crisis of both American and global capitalism. Dr. Faber served as coordinator of environmentalists for Bernie during the 2015-16 elections and was a major contributor to the 2016 Climate and Environmental Justice Platform of presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders. He's currently writing a series of new climate justice reports for the Global Center for Climate Justice relating to climate refugees, the climate impacts of corporate-led globalization and neoliberalism, voter suppression, the global pesticide crisis, the case for a Green New Deal, and more equitable policy approaches for dealing with climate change. And he's also working on a new book entitled The Ecological Contradictions of American Capitalism Toward Transformative Environmentalism. This is a big subject, an important subject. Some call climate change an existential issue, but it doesn't feel so existentialist anymore. So welcome, Danny. And my first question, as we always ask our guests, is just a little bit of backstory in terms of how did you find yourself really on the front lines of climate change activism?
I came from a very political family, and we were Northerners that moved to the South. We lived in Nashville, Tennessee, and at a young age, my father became involved as a consultant on some of the leading school desegregation cases around the country and became an active participant in the civil rights movement. And this was a very volatile issue because it included busing and school desegregation. So I think my earliest political education occurred at age 5 when I picked up the phone and the person at the other line said, "I'm going to kill you and all your family." And I said, "Dad, it's for you." And so we grew up in a family where my dad was really fundamentally committed to this notion of equality and justice, regardless of race and class and education policy. And that really, his values infused my own. And so later in life, my sister became a lawyer, and she worked with AppleRed in Appalachia, which represents communities and poor families that don't have the means to defend themselves. And in often these cases, a company would come in and strip mine a mountain. It's called mountaintop removal now, where you blow up the top of the mountain to expose the coal. You push all the rubble, what's called overburden, to the edge of the mountain. And when the rains come, it would result in a landslide and bury some homes underneath the mountain, or even sometimes a community. And she would represent them. in cases, and she received death threats. Someone shot her dog, and then one night a coal truck tried to run her off the road. And so I became really interested in Appalachia, which was a major source of producing energy wealth for the US and the world, particularly in the area of coal, but yet his residents remain some of the poorest in the nation. And sort of made this connection as Appalachia as a neo-colony, and looked at the tremendous ecological devastation that the residents had to endure. And I started doing environmental justice work in rural Appalachia.
Hmm.
And decided I was doing a lot of activism at the University of Kentucky, where I got my undergraduate degree, and decided I want to make this my life because I love the environment, go canoeing and camping, and it was really a passion for me, and went to the University of California, Santa Cruz. And there, this was in the 1980s when Reagan was beginning his policies of intervening in Central America. And at the time, in 1979, there was a popular revolution which overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. And the new government proceeded to institute some of the most far-reaching environmental programs of any country in the global South. And they were a fundamental component of the revolutionary project. And so we formed an organization, Environmental Project on Central America, and we were first working at Friends of the Earth and later Earth Island Institute. David Brower, for some of you who may or may not know who he is, was the chair then, and he became sort of a champion of our work. David Brower was single-handedly responsible from saving the Grand Canyon from being dammed by the US government in the 1950s. At that time, he was chair of the Sierra Club. And we began taking a number of high-level congressional delegations and environmentalists to Central America to expose them to the tremendous advances that were being made in Nicaragua, but also to point out how issues of poverty, human rights violations, US foreign policy, and the ecological crisis in Central America all came together, and we were working for a transformation of US policy on both human rights and ecological grounds. And this is really important because then I began making the connections between sort of internal colonies of Appalachia and the external colonies of Central America. And we had tremendous success in beginning to open the eyes of many environmentalists to these types of connections of unjust political economic systems and US imperialism in Central America. And so then, sorry for the long biography, but it's really an interesting journey that many of my colleagues have also undertaken. When I came to Northeastern, I established the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaborative, and we began working with the leadership of the environmental justice movement all over the United States, which at that time was just beginning to emerge in the early 1980s. And so, for example, one of the reports I did was called Green of Another Color, and it looked at how the US environmental justice movement, organizations working in low-income communities of color that are often on the front lines of the ecological crisis, were grossly underfunded, if not completely neglected by the foundation world. In fact, I put all the numbers together and concluded that this was one of the most underfunded social movements in the United States. And so at that point, I began doing work around environmental justice issues, both within the state of Massachusetts, helped write executive order environmental justice for Governor Patrick, environmental justice policy for the state, but also working at the national and international level. And so my work today with the Global Center for Climate Justice, again, we work on all these different levels. We wrote the Green New Deal program for Michelle Wu, the first mayoral candidate of any major American city who ran on a Green New Deal, who was elected in the city of Boston. Now we've formed a Green New Deal coalition. But at the same time, we're working globally with communities and movements all over the world around a range of different issues. So I like to wear many, many different hats, and our goal is to sort of bring together these different movements and activists from all over the world and try to forge a more common agenda around climate justice.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's not only are you immersed and see firsthand the catastrophe of climate change, but you're also working towards, as we call this program, toward a new future. So you mentioned the many hats you wear, Danny. Could you, because you were telling me before we went on, some of the organizations in your bio, I mentioned some, but especially the Coming Clean organization and what that is.
Right. And I think if I was to describe my commitment, my overall commitment is to cultivate a more transformative environmental and climate politics, which addresses the root causes of the ecological crisis. And so, for example, I'm on the governing board of Coming Clean. Coming Clean is a coalition of about 130 different organizations, some 200 different scientists and other professionals that are working for a more transformative environmental politics with regard to chemicals and energy policy. So the Greenpeace, National Resources Defense Council, but also the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, a lot of organizations that are working against hydraulic fracturing and gas extraction, or EJ communities like in Cancer Alley between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, are part of the coalition. You probably never heard of us, and that's intentional because we kind of work behind the scenes to develop strategy for the movement as a whole and to channel resources to grassroots organizations that otherwise have very little resources, but are working for some really deep solutions. So an example of this would be precautionary principle, the mandatory phase out of toxic chemicals. In Europe, under a program called REACH, the burden is placed upon industry to prove that a chemical is safe before it can be introduced into the marketplace. In the United States, the burden is placed upon individuals and communities to prove that a chemical is dangerous after it's been introduced into the marketplace, which means we're all guinea pigs. And only after you have a major human health disaster, such as DDT or and breast cancer or the lead contamination of Flint, do you have any type of regulation. And even then, it takes many years of struggle. Europe has banned thousands of chemicals. We banned 5. And so our approach is that if there is a strong suspicion that a chemical causes harm to human health, precautionary principle, or that it's proven that such a chemical should not be utilized in the American economy, that we need to prioritize human health over the profits of these industry. And it's been proven in Europe that you can do that. You can produce products that are non-toxic, that are perfectly functional. So that's what we mean about a more transformative environmental politics. Rather than regulating a chemical here or limiting its exposure there, let's just phase out whole families of chemicals that are known to be dangerous to human health and the environment.
Yeah.
And so that's an example of a more transformative environmental politics.
Yeah, and you could say the same thing about in America versus Europe, food and pharmaceuticals, the same thing. Things get taken off the market after enough harm is caused. So it's all interrelated.
And I think the one thing I would add about this is kind of interesting in comparison to EU and many other countries. In an era of neoliberalism, how much of the US economy is completely unregulated? So let's take personal care products. Over 50% of all the lipstick sold in the United States contains lead. There are baby shampoos. Johnson & Johnson, its US formula had 2 different carcinogens, one of which was formaldehyde. It was illegal to sell that formula in Europe. So Johnson & Johnson made a different formulation to sell in Europe because the European Union considered it to be toxic waste. And so the routes of exposure, we have a chemicalization of our everyday environment. 500,000 Americans get cancer each and every year. We have a breast cancer epidemic that claims over 40,000 women each and every year. We know that 90% of all breast cancer cases stem from chemical exposure. And you can take a woman from a culture where there's no history of breast cancer and place her in the United States, and within 1 year, within 1 generation, they will have the same breast cancer rates as the general population. So we are one dimension of this ecological crisis is this chemicalization of our everyday environment that is resulting in huge changes in our quality of life, cancer rates, all types of changes in human physiology. Women reach puberty now, some 2 years earlier than they did 30 years ago. Male semen count, male sperm counts have been declining. And there's a lot, Emily Swan wrote a great book on this, talking about how, many scientists now believe our very physiology is being altered by chronic exposure to chemicals and growth hormones and antibiotics.
Yeah, it's without a doubt. And that's why, it's important that you also look at the root causes in your work, the environmental crisis, the global environmental crisis, and see the relationship between that and neoliberal capitalism. Just basically that greed is good and free market reigns, and why should there be regulations? I'm not making a case for that. I'm just saying that's kind of the philosophy, and we pay the price.
Yeah, I think in many ways, we can speak of not just an ecological crisis that is national and global in scope, but also a crisis of environmentalism. And by that, what I mean is that while the environmental movement traditionally has won some very important battles, overall, we're losing the war. And the paradox that the movement faces is that, well, on the one hand, particularly going back to the 1970s, the US environmental movement has emerged as one of the most powerful social movements in this country's history. Some 40 million Americans belong to over 10,000 environmental organizations right now. And the vast majority of the American people consider themselves to be supportive of environmental protection. So we have this tremendous change in consciousness, tremendous numbers of people involved in the movement, yet the movement has largely failed to achieve its primary goal, which is to arrest the ecological crisis, which continues to deepen. So it's time that activists in the movement and all of us take a hard look at why we have failed. Why is this crisis continuing to grow? And I think in many ways, there are a lot of contradictions that have been embedded within the traditional liberal regime of environmental regulation that was put into place going back to the 1970s. A reliance on cost benefit analyses that somehow any policy that gets adopted, the economic benefits have to outweigh the cost. Well, as we saw in Love Canal, for example, you talked to Lois Gibbs, when the state was calculating whether it was worth it for them to clean up all the dioxin that had been dumped by Hooker Chemical in Love Canal, they did an economic analysis and they found, well, her husband, who worked at Hooker Chemical, by the way, his annual earnings are $10,000. So you multiply that by the number of years he's likely to work. That gives you his economic value. But she was a housewife. She didn't bring any economic value in these studies. So her value was zero. Her daughter made the same assumption. Her life was worth zero. So these economic calculations, cost benefit analysis, are incredibly biased towards working class families and so forth. They aren't worth protecting. The other would be risk assessment, that we can somehow know what the exposure to a certain chemical such as lead or formaldehyde over time is going to result in X number of diseases per 1,000 people. And that's really just a fallacy. Most environmental policy in this country is just based on this tremendous mythology that we can understand, let alone control the exposure rates of the American people to these different types of toxic materials. And we know precisely what will be the health outcomes of this exposure. And that all the testing that's done in the labs is for one chemical in isolation from the over 100,000 chemicals which are now registered for use in the United States. But we know if you take one chemical that might be rather benign and it comes into contact with another, the impacts on the human health can be deadly. So we just operate on this assumption that we know and can regulate the exposure of the American people to substances which are actually deadly. So if you look at lead, for example, well, 20, 30 years ago, what was assumed to be a safe level of lead, we now know causes severe and permanent brain damage in children. So there's been this political reaction over the last 20 years in the United States to these contradictions embedded in the liberal regime of environmental regulation. So on the one hand, in the eyes of industry, major corporate polluters, all these regulations serve to do is raise cost, lower productivity. They restrict the ability of capital to pollute at will and to exploit the environment. And so rather than using the stick to enforce corporations to engage in good environmental behavior by finding their activities, they're in favor of what I call an oxymoron, free market environmentalism, where we're going to use rewards to get companies to do the same thing. At the same time, we're just going to deregulate the economy and make it voluntary on behalf of corporations. This is, and we'll come back to this and discuss neoliberalism and free market environmentalism. But then there's also this reaction on the left. And hopefully we can talk about both of these political tendencies. The reaction on the left has been, well, okay, since you haven't really altered the nature of the economy to stop producing toxics and hazardous waste, so now you can't dump hazardous waste in the ocean. Okay, well, that's a good thing. You can't dump it in the Charles River or the Housatonic or the Hudson River. That's a good thing. But if all the toxic waste is now collected in barrels and then contracted out to chemical waste management, and then they ship it 1,000 miles to an incinerator to a poor Black community in Alabama, where it's burned there and then ends up polluting that community, all you've done is transfer the crisis or the hazard from one form to another, from one part of the country and from one group of people to another. And so this is why we have seen the rise of an environmental justice movement, because as pollutions become commodified and becomes increasingly mobile, it's being dumped onto those communities that lack the political economic power to resist. Hence the rise of working class white communities, and particularly low income communities of struggle, engaging in environmental justice struggles to prevent this increased displacement of harm onto their communities. So there's a critique that's forged there. And of course, where we are more transformative politics, let's go to the root causes. Let's stop producing these problems in the first place so that no one is harmed, regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, and place of location.
Yeah, and then you know, the American economic engine runs on GDP. That's its fuel. And so, you know, harming communities of color, low income or working class by moving, as you were talking about, moving toxic waste to Alabama, or toxic waste dumps anywhere, or more leaden products, and it affects people. Healthcare costs go up, but all we see is the quantitative output of that. GDP rises. Like healthcare in America is 20% of GDP, and it just keeps going up. So there's such a skewed perspective on this, and it just, as I said, it's an engine. It's just something, a locomotive out of control that can't be stopped. So there we have another part of the problem that you know, of neoliberalism, GDP. So what do we do about that?
No, it's a really interesting perspective. So from the viewpoint of capital, any money that's allocated towards pollution control technology, like installing a scrubber on a smokestack so you don't have air particulate matter coming out and contaminating the air in a local community, that's considered unproductive expenditure. A scrubber can cost $10 or $20 million, but it doesn't increase the productivity or the efficiency of the firm. It's just a cost. So environmental regulations, for the most part, particularly into the pipe technologies, raise the cost of capital without increasing efficiency, labor productivity, and so forth. So all things being equal, capital will always seek to avoid these regulations. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but how capital has organized itself politically into what I call a polluter industrial complex, which is leading the charge for environmental deregulation in order to roll back these regulations so that it can both increase the rate of exploitation of nature and labor, human nature, but also engage in massive cost cutting by not having to engage in sustainable environmental practices and capture pollutants and so forth. So If you think about it, though, this is one of the most fundamental violations of our human rights. One of the most fundamental human rights that we have is the right to a healthy and clean environment, to drink pure water, to eat uncontaminated food, and to live in a healthy environment. It's a right that's guaranteed by the Constitution of Massachusetts, many other states, as well as certain countries like Brazil. It's written into the Constitution. So whenever capital knowingly engages in antisocial or anti-ecological behavior by endangering the environment in which we live, this is rightly perceived, if they understand it, by communities to be an assault upon those communities, an assault upon their quality of life. So what capital, how they engage in this, we understand the reasons. It's to increase productivity and cut cost and profit maximization. And the more competitive the market, the more compelled they are to engage in anti-ecological behavior. And in the era of corporate-led neoliberal globalization, you get hyper competition in the global economy because now you're competing with nations with almost no or little environmental regulation. The impetus for corporations, particularly those in the US, to cut environmental expenditures is enormous. So, but they do so according not just to a logic of economic efficiency, but also political expediency. How can we do this? How can we engage in this antisocial and ecological harm in such a way that will not engender blowback, that will not come back to haunt us, that offers the path of least resistance? And so one of the things I've been doing and writing about is all the different strategies that American corporations, particularly oil and gas industry and other major corporate polluters, what strategies are they using to externalize or displace all this harm onto us? Rather than internalizing those costs by engaging more sound production, they externalize or displace this harm onto the general public. And one of the strategies you'll see is that more and more American industry is seeking to displace this harm onto communities that lack the political economic power to defend themselves. And in the United States, that means white working class communities and communities of color. So if you got a second, I'll give you a really good example of how this plays out. In the state of California, for example, the industry wanted a cheaper way to dispose of garbage and toxic waste and medical waste. So the solution proposed by the state of California is incinerators. We're just going to burn it. But anytime you burn garbage or toxic waste, what comes out of the smokestack of the incinerator are super toxics, like dioxins and heavy metals and mercury. It's extremely dangerous to live near an incinerator. So in California, there was a full-fledged rebellion on behalf of these communities where they wanted to locate these incinerators. So the state commissioned Sorrell Associates, a consulting firm, to help them figure out a solution to this problem on behalf of the state and polluting industry in California. And on page 51 of the report, they conclude, under no such circumstances does such a facility be built within a 1 mile radius of a white middle class community, because of the greater likelihood of encountering political opposition. Instead, the state should target low-income communities, they footnote communities of color, rural communities, Catholic communities because they're considered to be more conservative, or communities where the offending facility is on one line of political jurisdiction and the affected population is on the other. Nowhere in the report do they talk about citing these facilities in the most optimum geologic, geographic, or climatic conditions that would minimize the harm to the general public. No, it was solely in terms of the ability of a community to offer political opposition. After the report is released, the state of California built some 17 different incinerators in Southern California. Every single one of them was built in a low-income community of color in Los Angeles. 90% of the residents living in the high-impact zones around these incinerators, the 5 mile zones, were low-income people of color. So this is an example where instead of adopting new production techniques that reduce pollution, that eliminate toxics, that engage in more sustainable production, American capital is adopting increasingly destructive and more polluting technologies and seeking to increasingly displace that harm onto white working class communities and communities of color. This is an example of environmental justice and in particular environmental racism. And it's a parallel policy. There's a national strategy around this. Again, that's why we've seen the growth of the environmental justice movement in the last 20 years. And the Biden administration is taking enormous action. They are devoting billions of dollars right now to correct these injustices through the Justice 40 program. 40% of all the funds there have to be targeted to EJ communities, and the IRA. So the Biden administration is finally trying to really engage in a politics of restorative justice and try to repair the harm that's been done there. But it's also about exporting these injustices or these harms onto the global South, onto countries that also lack the political economic power to resist. And hence we've seen an internationalization of the ecological crisis and the growth of an environmentalism of the poor and environmental justice struggles throughout the global South. So it's both a domestic and an international strategy.
And hence you end up with climate refugees coming to the global North looking for safe havens, and then the whole immigration crisis. That's a whole nother, well, it's different another story, but interconnected thread.
Yeah, and if you read the Pentagon considers this to be a major threat that is unfolding.
Right. That's right.
To U.S. national security concerns. The same with the British government. They commissioned Isaac Stern to do a study on what are the likely impacts of a 1 to 3 foot sea level rise by mid-century 2050 on the world's populations. And they conclude that over 200 million people are likely to be displaced by sea level rise alone. And that they consider, we've already seen the turmoil that's occurred in the European Union with the immigration of 5 to 6 million people. Now imagine 200 million. Imagine the politics of the United States. I have to say, I'm sorry to say this, but the Stern report is hopelessly out of date. The United Nations predicts 500 million people to be displaced by sea level rise alone between 2050, 2070. There's a study at Cornell University that draws on James Hansen's predictions, James Hansen being one of the leading climatologists who worked for the US government for the Garden Center, considered, along with Michael Mann and others, the leading expert on climate change. He thinks 10 feet is locked into the system by the end of the century. So Cornell ran the numbers, 50% of the world's population lives within 10 feet of the seacoast. They look at somewhere around 1 billion or more people being displaced just by sea level rise alone by the end of the century. So this is the urgency of the issue. This is on a magnitude that is difficult to imagine, of what, even the worst dystopian novels can't even conceive of these types of economic, social disruptions that climate change portends for our future if it remains unchecked. So this is the greatest challenge that we face. I have to say this line because we had a meeting the other day with Jane Fonda. And as you know, Jane Fonda's been an activist for a long time, and she just started this new super PAC. It's called the Jane Fonda Super PAC, and she's devoting the rest of her life and considerable resources to raising money to support candidates who are really going to stand up and make this the #1 issue, because we have to begin electing candidates who are fighting for this issue. And her line was, and I think it's absolutely correct, this is the first generation in history that can really see, feel, and taste climate change. It's readily apparent. It's obvious. I think the latest study showed 1 out of every 2 Americans lived in a county this past year. Last year was 1 out of every 3 Americans lived in a county that experienced a climate-related natural disaster. So the climate crisis is here, but it's also the first generation that, and the only generation that can stop it. So we're the first experience, but we're the only generation that can stop it. And if we don't see dramatic reductions in emissions in the next 7 to 10 years, we're going to pass these tipping points, at which point we won't be able to contain it and it will begin to feed upon itself and we won't be able to stop it. So this is a unique responsibility that this generation that we experience that is really new and no other generation has had to face.
Uh-huh. Yeah, thank you for bringing up. Well, thank you for being part of the group that met with Jane Fonda and being aware of what she's doing. And so I want to circle in just a little bit on those solutions and that whole and all the movements, but just a little more. Talking about what these corporations are doing and their reckless behavior in the name of profits. It's almost in a way, and I've read estimates that about 100 trillion dollars of energy reserves sits in the earth. I might be wrong, but some large amounts. So it's pretty much, and it seems like, why would these energy companies stop? Keep going. But what, in a way, don't you think that some of these companies would realize, as capitalists, we're destroying capitalism. Besides destroying the world, we're destroying our chance to keep making profits. It's like a logical conundrum. What do you say to that?
No, that's exactly right. So the estimates of known fossil fuel reserves in the world today are somewhere 27 trillion on the low end, 100 trillion on the high end. I think the higher end is a more realistic estimate. And so if all these known fossil fuel reserves are developed by the oil and gas industry, which they are currently planning to do, as seen in Exxon's just purchase of Pioneer Energy in Texas, $59 billion. Chevron just had another major purchase. They are doubling down. The big oil companies are looking to greatly expand fossil fuel production in the coming years. But if they develop all these known reserves, then they will take us 5 times beyond what the scientific community says is safe. And we will live in a world 11 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by the end of the century than what it is now. And the scientific community says, if we allow that to happen, you are looking at a 40% ecosystem collapse around the world. And you will look at heat indexes approaching 160, 170 degrees in the equatorial region. And basically, you're going to render large swaths of the earth unfit for human habitation. And I'm not exaggerating this. This is in the IPCC report. And there is a strong consensus developing among the scientific community that the aims of the fossil fuel industry are fundamentally incompatible with the needs of humanity and the planet, that they are fundamentally at odds. And yet the fossil fuel industry is doubling down. And one of the things that I think is very, very interesting, we just did a big report on this. We're doing a number of investigations with Greenpeace and leadership of many environmental organizations. Over the last 30 or 40 years, the major corporate polluters in this country, such as the oil and gas industry, petrochemical, mining, timber interests, coal mining, railroads, along with many banks and insurance companies, have formed what we call the polluter industrial complex. There's about 128 organizations involved. They've created a very sophisticated infrastructure of think tanks, policy institutes, research centers that have undertaken one of the most massive propaganda campaigns in the history of humanity, which is namely to convince us that climate change is not real and does not pose a threat to our future. There are 91 organizations, think tanks, policy institutes that are promoting climate denialism or delay. Some of them are multi-issue organizations like Heritage or Cato, and others are devoted exclusively to climate change like the Heartland Institute. And their income is over over $800 million a year. And the vast majority of these resources are coming from the Koch brothers and ExxonMobil. And they are flooding the American political system with huge campaign contributions to favored candidates such as Joe Manchin from West Virginia. In the immediate aftermath of the Capitol riot, the 147 members of Congress who voted to decertify the election received $700,000 in contributions from just 6 oil companies.
Yeah.
And so this is the part that's really interesting. I think it's getting to a point where it's very obvious to the American people that the climate crisis has arrived. 2023 is going to be the hottest year ever recorded since humanity's been on the planet. It's going to surpass 2022. Anyone who's was born in the 21st century has never experienced a year of the average temperature from the 20th century. We have literally entered a new climactic period. And so climate denialism is proving to be increasingly unviable as a political strategy. And so the tactics are turning darker and more radical. There's a radicalization that's occurring among the oil and gas industry and major corporate polluters. And we just put together a report on this. So the very same policy infrastructure that they put together to push deregulation of oil and gas and to lead the attack on the climate change, environmental justice, and environmental movements, they have now created a host of different organizations that operate within these same policy institutes that are now leading the charge on terms of attacking voting rights and voter suppression initiatives. And to give you an example of how extreme this is, this attack on American democracy, because I think they've come to the conclusion if we have free and fair elections, they're going to lose. So they're trying to rig the game. So 17 million Americans have been purged off the voting rolls in the United States since 2016. Over 400 bills aimed at restricting voting rights were introduced in 2021, 383 bills in 2022, and 322 bills in 2023, and the year isn't even over yet, introduced at the state level to roll back voting rights. And what they're doing is they're really targeting low-income communities of color that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. They're on the front lines of the ecological crisis that are leading the charge against building new pipeline or fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as young people. And one of the primary reasons for this is these are the strongest pro-environment voters in America today. The Asian Congressional Caucus has the strongest voting rights record in Congress, followed by the Hispanic Congressional Caucus, followed by the Black Congressional Caucus. And so some of the strongest proponents of environmental protection and climate change legislation come from the districts that are on the front lines, that are mostly indigenous or communities of color and young voters. So some of these tactics are really just, I consider them to be neo-fascist in character. So if you're going to close 80% of the polling places in Fulton County, Georgia, which is predominantly African American, then that means you go to work all day and you come home, and now you have to travel a longer distance to go to the polls to vote. And now you're standing in line with 500 other people and you have to wait in line for 4 or 5 hours. So that's a long time. So your friends or family bring you food and water. And what the Georgia legislature did is they passed a law making it a felony for anyone giving food or water who's standing in line to vote. In the Dakotas, the state legislature passed a rule that you have to have a street address. You can't have a post office box. Well, if you're an indigenous person living on a reservation, you don't have a street address. You just have a post office box. So that rule just disenfranchised 10,000 indigenous peoples in the Dakotas. And of course, that's where you've had all these battles around, the Standing Rock and other type struggles around fossil fuel infrastructure. Texas, you can no longer it's illegal to have a polling place on a college campus. You can show a hunting license as an ID. You can show a driver's license. 27% of all African Americans don't have a driver's license. It's required to show an ID, but you can't show a student ID. So this is a very, very targeted effort by the oil and gas industry and other major corporate polluters. And here's the main point that I want to communicate on this, because I think our democracy is in trouble. Our democracy is under a major assault. The oil and gas industry provided tens of millions of dollars to state legislators who introduced these voter suppression initiatives all throughout the country. And we in our report at the Global Center for Climate Justice, we've documented all this money. It's all coming from the oil and gas industry. So the way the mainstream media covers this is that, oh, this is coming from the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. They're the ones that are leading this attack on voting rights. They're the ones that are crying voter fraud. And by the way, the Brennan Center for has done tremendous work on this, and they did an exhaustive study of over 1 billion votes cast in the country since 2015. There's been exactly 31 cases of voter fraud. Yeah. It's a mythology. You are much more likely to be hit by lightning than to live in a state where someone has committed voter fraud in the last 5 years. It's such a rarity, but yet it's used to justify all of these different actions as put forth by the Heritage Foundation, which is heavily funded by Kochs and ExxonMobil and major gas interests. In fact, the founder of Heritage Foundation said, we actually don't want people to vote in this elections. The more people to vote, the more it works against our economic interest. So these politicians, there's no way in the world they would engage in these tactics to promote various forms of voter suppression and attack on voting rights if they were punished by their corporate backers. But instead, and this is the key point, this attack on voting rights is actually being organized, funded, and administered by the very same oil and gas interests and corporate polluters that have been funding climate denialism for the past 30 years. And what's really alarming to me is the fact that now we see a growing replacement of nonpartisan election officials who oversee our election process with increasingly partisan election officials who are funded by the oil and gas industry. Trump recently said that elections aren't won by, elections aren't decided by people who vote. Elections are decided by the people who count the votes. And as Steve Bannon and others said, we need to take over the election machinery. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm saying to you is that this effort to take over the election machinery is being funded to the tune of tens of millions of dollars by the oil and gas industry and other major corporate polluters. We've documented it in the report. We got all the numbers. They're the ones who created the organizations. And I think that's because with the advancement of neoliberalism, and as the climate crisis becomes increasingly untenable, and all the various manifestations of the ecological crisis become more extreme, then the oil and gas industry is going to lose if it's truly a democratic system. So they have to begin disenfranchising people who are experiencing the greatest hardships if they are going to protect their economic interests going into the future.
So it's really the groundswell of bottom up, some top down, bottom up to change the tide. You mentioned Jane Fonda and what she's doing, and I'm sure she has some other people with her. You mentioned earlier, Danny, the Biden administration and the money they've put in through the Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Acts.
Yeah, and Justice 40 and Justice 40.
So can you speak a little bit about what's going on with that?
Yeah, so there's a notion of restorative justice. That is that the Biden administration really came in committed to rectifying past wrongs. And I'll say more about the Biden administration because I think they're doing many things that are highly contradictory. But they actually hired away a good friend of mine and a colleague at Northeastern, Shalonda Baker, to run the Justice 40 program. She wrote a very interesting book, by the way, called Revolutionary Power. And it had a dual meaning to tackle the ecological crisis and climate change, we need to revolutionize our energy or power systems. And to do that, we need to revolutionize our power structures, our power relations within the country, that We can't achieve one without the other. And part of that is by seeking to remake environmental problem solving by involving the residents of the communities most affected by the ecological crisis. So how can we design new solutions and approaches that actually involve the people who are most affected directly? And so Justice 40 is about channeling 40% of all the climate related funds into low income communities of color. And they just today announced, I think it was $188 million in funds. It's coming in many different installments to some 88 different communities that have put forth proposals to address environmental injustice. So this is the good news. We are at this moment. This is a critical moment. And one of the things that we did, for example, with Michelle Wu, who ran on a Green New Deal, and I think this is a very important point that
who is the mayor of Boston at this
who's the
moment.
mayor of Boston.
Yeah.
And part of what we were trying to do at the center, our executive director, Christina Schlegel, wrote the Green New Deal platform for Michelle Wu when she ran for mayor. And we have a fuller version of the report on our website. And the idea is, it's very, as we were talking about before we started, it's very easy for individuals when confronted with the magnitude of the ecological crisis, when confronted with the existential threat that is climate change, to feel completely overwhelmed, to feel a sense of despair, to feel a sense of hopelessness. In fact, it's now a new subcategory within the field of psychology, climate despair. It's become a new subfield because it's become so widespread. And there's a lot of reasons for this, and I've done the research on this and how the media covers it, and the way the media covers it often magnifies these feelings. But what we have to begin doing as scholars and activists in the movement and ordinary citizens with our friends and our fellow citizens is showing how climate change can be a catalyst for recreating society, and perhaps a brand new society that is better than anything that we've seen in history. And so one of the interesting things about Sholanda's work is that she does a lot of work on the notion of energy democracy. So if you can demonstrate to people how becoming part of the climate change movement can actually result in improvements in their quality of life for them and their children, how they can lead a better life, then people will become excited and enthusiastic about becoming part of this movement rather than retreating in fear and despair. So one example of this around energy democracy, the notion is that, well, if we can provide resources and incentives and so forth so that people can install solar collectors directly on their home, as I have done, so they produce enough energy not only to provide all the needs that they have for their home, but then now they export it onto the grid so that the utility, instead of you sending them a check at the end of the month, they send you a check. You are now not only an energy consumer, but an energy producer. Here's a solution to the climate crisis that has increased your quality of life. It's bringing you extra income. It's given you greater autonomy and control over your own energy supplies. And we refer to this as a type of emancipatory or transformative climate politics, where the solutions to the climate crisis serve to empower ordinary people, give them greater wealth, resources, and better prospects for the future. You can have solar collectors out in the desert that are still owned by utility, and they transport energy to your house on the grid and still charge you very high interest energy rates. That hasn't necessarily done anything to improve your quality of life. So Shalonda Baker, this was her philosophy, and Biden picked her to head up the Justice 40 program. And so this philosophy is being put into operation. So that's the good news. This is a tremendous moment. And so if we're trying to build a Green New Deal in cities like Boston, which is highly intersectional, like how do issues of affordable housing and transportation and climate resiliency, how do they come together around a larger social justice issue? There are many communities in the United States that treat public transportation as a right of citizenship. Park City, electric buses, free transportation for everyone in the city. Kansas City and others. So how can we transform the way we think about city services as sort of rights that are fundamental to solving the climate crisis? And it takes money. So in this particular moment, to make this transition happen, all this money is coming down from the federal government that is enabling cities and towns and even states to have the resources necessary for this transition. So that's why all the activists I know, we're all working 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, because we have to take advantage of this historical moment. The problem with all this is that there's two interesting dimensions. One is, it's like, to me, it's the equivalent of building an airplane while it's going down the runway. They're trying to figure all this out at the same time they're giving out all this money, and they don't have it all figured out. And furthermore, there's a lot of organizations that have been in an oppositional mode with the state, pressuring the state to do the right thing, to institute sound environmental policies and to invest in sustainable and just development in communities. And now the state, the federal government, is asking them to be partners. And many organizations in the movement aren't equipped. They don't have the resources or the know-how to play this role as partners in helping figure out these answers. Many do, but many don't. And the other thing that's coming up, and this is a sort of a failure of higher education, but it's also a function of the power of the polluter industrial complex. There's a new piece in The Guardian that just came out, said there are 400 lobbyists working with all kinds of organizations, cultural organizations, all over the United States, 140 fossil fuel lobbyists that work on behalf of major universities. Northeastern University, we have a vice president of ExxonMobil on our board of trustees. We're trying to get them to divest. Universities have done a really poor job of educating people with the expertise that are needed to make this transition to green chemistry, renewable energy, and so forth. We don't have enough people with the expertise to do the solar installations and so forth. So there are these bottlenecks that are appearing that have to be figured out if we're going to make this transition. But it's also just a very exciting time, if not hopeful time, because the resources are there and we have to make sure that they're used to the best benefit. So that's it. But let me just say this other thing. And this was true under Obama as well as it is true for Biden. Obama tried to have it both ways. The last 20 years, so much of US economic policy has been predicated on the tremendous expansion of fossil fuel production in the United States. This October, the United States reached an all-time high, 13.2 million barrels of oil per day. That is twice the level of oil output from 2012. We are now pumping more oil out of the ground and natural gas than at any time in US history. So while renewable energies have now make up 18% of the total energy supply in the world economy, that's seen as enormous progress. You know, we're on the verge of this energy transition. It's really more of an energy addition, because due to the Jevons paradox, as energy becomes cheaper, the use of fossil fuels is also expanding at the same time that renewables are becoming a bigger portion of overall energy use. So this is a response, in some way, it's bipartisan, it's both Democratic and Republican. So under Obama, the US became for the first time, the biggest producer of hydrocarbons in the world. And under Biden, the US has now produced more oil, more barrels of oil than any time in our history. The two things are incompatible. You can't be doing these two things at the same time. You can't be investing in climate resilience and trying to climate-proof communities in the most just and sustainable manner. At the same time, you're giving carte blanche to the fossil fuel industry to keep ramping up production. The two are fundamentally incompatible. So this is the weird paradox in which we live. We're seeing some really important victories. At the same time, we're seeing these horrible defeats.
Yeah, and The majority of Americans at this point, demographically, are on the political spectrum are left of center, liberal, progressive, even
Yeah,
democratic socialism. I think by the numbers are growing and growing. Jamel Bowie in the New York Times today, one of the opinion writers, wrote how Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and millennials are by far liberal on the left spectrum wherever they are.
yeah,
Um, so the movement is there. You talked about again what Jane Fonda did. It's just and all these climate movements, climate rebellion, sunrise movement, the lawsuits, Juliana versus the United States, what happened in Montana, the lawsuit there. And it's growing. And as you point out, the issue is it's like building an airplane as it's on the runway, because we're trying to build a society that we've never we don't have the instruction manual for. But
yeah. And
um,
I would say the oil and gas industry and other major corporate polluters recognize this. They
mhm,
recognize that Gen Z sees their future is in jeopardy. And
uh-huh,
that's again why we see targeted actions to disenfranchise or attack the voting rights of specific components of the population, the most pro-climate, most pro-environmental voters in communities of color and young people. And I wouldn't be surprised in the next 3 year, 4 years, you see resolutions introduced, particularly if you have Republican majorities, to raise the voting age again once more
yeah,
from 18 back to
uh-huh,
21, because that's
yeah,
being discussed right now in the policy circles, I can tell you.
uh-huh,
So, and it's part of a larger attack too on all kinds of citizens' rights. There's an effort now to criminalize public protest against
mhm,
fossil fuel infrastructure, make it a felony under terrorism charges. The attack on environment, social governance, or socially responsible investing, that's being criminalized in a number of states. So if there's a fundamental contradiction between our rights as citizens to a healthy and clean environment versus the private property rights of capital. And so,
mhm,
therefore, the solution that is increasingly being looked to by these major corporate polluters is to restrict the rights of citizenship of the most pro-environment voters. And this is why part of our democracy is in trouble. In the
mhm,
in the field, we call this the second contradiction of capitalism that's now becoming apparent. And that is, namely, while it's in the interest of every individual corporation to boost profits as much as possible by displacing as much harm in the form of pollution and environmental degradation onto the general public, the danger is that it destroys the ecological foundations for capitalism as a whole in the long
mhm,
run. And this is
yeah,
the major problem. When you ask me that question about capitalism, what is in the short-term interest of capital, profit maximization, is contrary to the long-term interest of capital. And what is in the interest of individual corporations is contrary to the interest of capital as a whole.
uh-huh,
So therefore, it requires a strong state to regulate the anti-environmental, anti-social behaviors of capital to resolve this contradiction. But in an era of neoliberalism, the capacity of the state to do such has been completely dismantled. So there's no mechanism to rein in capital. It's destroying the foundations for its own existence, so to speak, but
uh-huh,
also human civilization as we know it.
yeah, yeah. So this is the point. Wow, this is great, Danny. I mean, we can keep going. This is a point. If anyone wants to pose a question, you can put it in the chat box or in the Q&A box. While I keep talking to Danny, and we'll wrap it up too in the near future. Danny, people listening and who will watch the recording, what can they do? They might feel powerless in the face of all this. What could they do, either individually, collectively, in whatever way they could, to
Yeah.
do anything about this?
I think we got to reconceptualize what it means to be a citizen and to be a supporter of movements. And very often you see, like, if you talk to people, their notion is one of a very passive citizenship or a passive member organization, meaning, okay, you get asked for money, you give money, a petition comes away, you sign the petition, but you're not actually involved in the decision-making process and problem solving. You relinquish your power to others. And I think what we need is um, a new type of environmentalism that is more bottom up, involves grassroots organizing, involves people engaged in actual problem solving that directly impacts their lives. That's number one. Number two is, and that can involve your professional life. How can whatever institution you're involved in, how can you make that institution, if it's not necessarily part of the problem, maybe it is, how can you make it part of the solution? How can the organizations in which we live, work, play, and even pray, how can they become part of the solution? So not seeing ourselves as just sort of passive recipients of decisions made by elite power structures, but let's start taking control over the institutions and make them responsive to our demands. I think the other thing that's really key is, and the way I would say this, the goal of the environmental justice movement is not to ensure that all people are polluted equally. It makes for a terrible bumper sticker. It's not a great slogan, but rather I would say the goal of environmental justice movements and climate justice movements per se is to ensure that no one be harmed. And that means we have to transform the way our economy works so that the production of ecological harms is never allowed to occur. So it's not about not in my backyard, it should be about not in anyone's backyard. And so to get there, we have to begin addressing the root causes. And we're taking on the most powerful corporations in the world, the oil and gas industry. I mean, the profits of the industry were $200 billion last year just in oil and gas. So these are some of the most powerful corporations in the world that buy and sell politicians in the US almost at will. And so we have to mobilize ourselves into a multiracial, multi-class, multi-generational, multinational movement that has enough people power to challenge their hegemony. And that means developing an intersectional perspective. So while we may come from different walks of life and we may have significant geographic boundaries that separate us from one another, or class and racial differences that lead to very different types of lives, we all have a common interest in protecting the climate and protecting our future. So we have to overcome a sort of an identity politics which fragments people, and also look at how we share these common concerns. How can we develop solidarity so that we work in support of each other and with one another for these larger goals? And so for me, it's all about the revitalization of American democracy with a small d. And right now, first and most fundamental step is we have to prevent this takeover of American democratic institutions, and then we have to reclaim them for ourselves.
Yeah, without a doubt. Have you read the book Ministry for the Future, or are you familiar with it?
Stanley. My friend Chuck Collins, Stanley Kim Robinson just endorsed his new book too. And I just plug Chuck Collins, and it's really interesting. These books on dystopian futures are really, I think, are kind of interesting.
Yeah, to everyone watching this, please read the book. It's Kim Stanley Robinson's a well-known science fiction writer, and this is in the genre of sci-fi. And this Ministry for the Future, and it's a book about dystopic but hopeful in that he talks about the UN having an agency called the Ministry for the Future, and when a wet bulb incident happens in India, they start realizing that the shit has hit the fan and they really need to do something for it. And speaking of the UN, Antonio Guterres has been really outspoken on the subject of climate change. He's not in the Pope. Yeah, when you got the Pope and Antonio Guterres against you, it's time to throw in the white flag. And
you would think.
You would think. But
Yeah, I mean, Guterres has said this is a planetary emergency. He's called these special meetings. And the one thing I would say that's rather disturbing is that the latest meetings that were just held less than a month ago, Russia, China didn't show up, Biden didn't show up. The major carbon producing countries did not show up to this emergency summit. And so the global south was there, and I think we maybe see the beginnings of a non-aligned movement among countries in the global south, where they begin to create their own institutions that won't suffer the veto powers of the major carbon producing countries in the world. Russia's essentially a petrostate. China's coal production keeps going up and up and up. 1 million people die of air pollution each and every year in China. It's an ecological horror story. And the United States is increasing its oil production to unparalleled levels. So we cannot look to these countries to lead. I think this is the moment for the global South to take leadership in many of these forums. And until we can reclaim our democracy and get the US on the right track, it should come from the global South.
Yeah. So we have a question. How does the UN need to be reformed to have the power to fight the oil corporations? I mentioned Antonio Guterres. Does the UN have any teeth in anything they can do?
So Guterres is fighting an internal battle and external battle. He's trying to sort of democratize the UN and turn it into an instrument for fundamental change. At the same time, he's trying to prevent sort of a corporate takeover. And in some areas he's winning, in other areas he's losing. At the last COP convening, there were more lobbyists there, representatives of the oil and gas industry, than there were delegates from nations all over the world. So you think about that. And then, you know, the COP convention, Saudi Arabia, and then you have the oil and gas industry now playing a larger role in planning the COP conferences. So there's a real danger of the COP processes being hijacked by big oil, which would be an utter disaster. And Guterres wants mandatory emission reductions. He wants them to be more significant, quicker, more profound, and mandatory. And Paris has already failed. Paris cannot be achieved. Those were voluntary. There were no sanctions for any company, any country that didn't meet its pledges. And the US worked behind the scenes, as it has in almost every major international treaty, whether it's Stockholm, Basel, Rotterdam, all the major treaties that are dealing with ecological concerns, the export of hazardous waste, dangerous chemicals, pesticides that are banned in countries of their own origin. Every major treaty that's designed to prevent the displacement of ecological harm on the global South that enjoys the support of over 90% of the world's countries has not been ratified by the United States. We are an outlaw nation. And I don't know how many of the American people realize this, but when it comes to international environmental law, we are an outlaw nation. And we have consistently worked behind the scenes at all the COP conventions to prevent mandatory pledges from being implemented. And again, I think that speaks to the power of the oil and gas industry in American politics and international politics globally. And this is a mind-blowing fact. The IMF put out a recent report, and they showed that the global subsidies that go by governments to the oil and gas industry are in the order of $7 trillion a year of direct and indirect subsidies that go to the oil and gas industry. $7 trillion. If we want to get to zero emissions by 2050, which the scientific community says is an absolute necessity, that would cost an average of $3 to $4 trillion a year. And we can get there. It's all very possible. All we have to do is eliminate those subsidies for oil and gas and transfer them to the renewable energy transition. So
Mhm.
we can afford to do it. We have the technological know-how. And again, just speaks to the enormous power of this industry. And
Uh-huh.
so that's the good news. It is economically feasible. And in the US, it's about $40 billion a year.
Uh-huh.
So,
Huh.
yeah. So I think we have to start making demands of our elected leaders, and the UN has to do the same, where we have to begin outlawing the outrageous behavior of the oil and gas industry, and we have to begin redirecting funds toward the type of future that we want for ourselves and our children,
Yeah.
and away from those industries that are destroying the planet.
Yeah, right on. So I'll take one more question. Well, we got a couple questions that just came in. Let's see. I'll try and we'll take these last questions. One, Michael asked, what is the increase the increase in oil levels going towards automobile industry? So he's wondering where it goes.
Yeah, well, like with natural gas, with hydraulic fracturing, which, in the 2005 Energy Policy Act that was pushed by Dick Cheney when he was CEO of Halliburton, and they were the manufacturer and developer of the technology, it exempted the oil and gas industry from every major environmental statute, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, just unparalleled behavior on the part of the US government. So the cheap abundance of natural gas is phasing out coal, so it's being used more for power plant production. But there's also a new plastics boom. And so a lot of natural gas is being used to facilitate the increased production of plastics for all types of uses. The US is increasingly exporting natural gas to Europe, as well as China and Asia, hence the big battles that have been occurring in Seattle around the building out of new fossil fuel infrastructure for transportation, including the Alberta tar sands. The activists call it the thin green line has been drawn in the tar sands, if you will, of
Mhm.
Pacific Northwest. Oil production, transportation needs to keep going up. Our fuel economy standards are a joke. We are seeing electrification, but the number of cars keep going up. Again, Jevons paradox, more and more electrics, but also more internal combustion engines. And energy use, as you see increased levels of industrialization in the global south, is requiring more and more energy use to fuel industrialization to provide energy. And while renewables are a bigger part of the mix, Costa Rica, it's almost 100% renewables.
Mhm.
Germany, any given day, it's 30 to 40%. But then on the whole, the demands of fossil fuel energy are going up throughout the world as industrialization and development proceed. So it's across all sectors.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And we had a question, why isn't every state suing big oil like California is?
A lot of states are.
Uh,
Massachusetts, Northeastern states sued ExxonMobil for engaging in shareholder fraud. There's a slogan called Exxon New, and Exxon undertook these really amazingly accurate studies, as did Shell and other oil companies, that accurately predicted what would be the impacts of fossil fuels on the global climate. I mean, they were spot on.
from the
So
1970s.
from the 1970s.
Yeah.
And so their scientists told the executives that if we continue on this path, this is what's going to happen. So they withheld this information from the public. In fact, they began funding to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars annually these climate denial organizations that are designed to convince the public that climate change isn't real, even though they knew it was. That's not illegal. What was illegal was they withheld this information from their shareholders. Even while they were making business plans and modeling future economic development on the very types of climate analyses that they were denying publicly. So they're being charged in many number of states for engaging in shareholder fraud, for misleading their shareholders. There was a very important case in Oregon, as well as California, that's being led by youth that
Mhm.
fossil, and it's really aimed at the state. The state, by not clamping down on the fossil fuel industry, is endangering their future. And what's interesting about these cases is the judges have been agreeing. So I think pardon the pun, I think we're at the tip of the iceberg on these types of cases. I think we are going to see more and more of these types of cases. But here's the flaw in all this. It's the Supreme Court. They're inevitably going to end up at the Supreme Court. And if you look at the role of the Federalist Society, Leonard Leo, who is hugely funded by the oil and gas industry, Alito has deep ties to the oil and gas industry. Clarence Thomas used to be the lawyer for Monsanto. Their hands are literally dripping in oil. The Supreme Court is going to shoot down any of these cases that reach the High Court. So if you ask me what's probably the most important thing that needs to be done in the next 2 years under the Biden administration or in the next election, we got to expand the Supreme Court. And you need to have the same number of Supreme Court justices as there are districts in the US. The right wing packed the court. They're going to be there for 20 or 30 years, and they are going to block everything in their path that comes their way. So I think reforming the court is absolutely critical.
Yeah. All right. Danny, this is amazing. And we could keep going. We've been at it an hour and 20 minutes, and I'm gonna say we'll stop here. Maybe we can have you on as a guest another time. I also want you to maybe get some sleep since you work tirelessly.
Oh no, I'm working on another report right now. So it's
well, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. And everyone listening and everyone who'll watch the recording will appreciate it. And I hope everyone thinks what they can do, ways big and small, because this is the struggle for our future and to create a new future. So Danny,
yeah, thank you,
so
Michael.
much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, and I encourage everyone to check out the Global Center for Climate Justice and look for our resources or other organizations working in the area. I appreciate the fact that everyone took out time out of their night to be here, and hopefully you can use the information I provided to engage in some really meaningful action. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Danny. All right, peace out, man. Okay,
take care, everybody.